Newsom on direct. Newsom on direct. What are we looking into? So we started a book. I don't know what we call it, a book ritual, a book tradition. We started a book ritual, a book tradition over here at the network school. We just bought a bunch of books, we put in the middle, and we let people know that hey, free to read it, change your mind, change your perspective, and then put it back. And it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. Let's see if we can expand. We can expand this. All right, perfect. Yeah, it's been so far. It's been really good. I'm talking to a lot of people. I'm just and it's also about to trust a lot right now. Like we have to trust people. Trust is again very interesting. Trust goes both ways. I have to first trust you, and then you have to prove that my decision to trust you was right. So it's very interesting. Yeah, we are trusting a lot of individuals, and four books are right now not back, and these are some really good books. So let's see where that goes. But it's a very interesting ritual. It's a very interesting ritual. We printed out a bunch of network street books because again, very interesting that we are a network school, which all came about from this one book called Network State. But these books are not around for us to just pick up randomly, start reading, and engage in the concepts of network school. So very interesting. Tell me the most interesting insights from sorry, the network state. If I said network school, it's the network state book. Ruminating on it. Stand by. Conference territory and gains diplomatic recognition. Essentially, you can now start a country online first and acquire land later, reversing the historical order. States sort of a territory policy argues the internet enables communities to coalesce around shared. Wow, there's a beautiful bird that's singing right now. This is amazing. It's amazing. One commandment, not 10. A network state rallies around a single moral proposition. Life extension is a human right. This focused conviction is what holds the community together more than geography ever could. The newspaper of record is dead, replaced by the ledger of record. Balaji argues that blockchains and cryptographic proof will replace institution trust. Truth becomes something you verify, not something an authority declares. Something you verify, not something an authority declares. History is being rewritten in real time. He frames political power as fundamentally about who controls the narrative of the past and argues that decentralized media is fragmenting that control, creating both opportunities and chaos. The God State Network Framework. Three competing sources of legitimacy across history: religious authority, nation state authority, and now network authority. God State Network. This was very interesting that I pulled up randomly that chapter, and again, that chapter was amazing. This is it. Like, you're not supposed to be reading. I mean, it's not about reading cover to cover or whatever. It's about how the act of reading changes you. Just the act of reading changes you. Just the act of pulling a random page changes you. Religious authority, nation state authority, and now network authority. Each has its own moral system, enforcement mechanism, and vision of the good life. Practical takeaway: sovereignty is becoming a spectrum, not a binary. From special economic zones to charter cities to crypto communities, there's a growing marketplace for governance, and people will increasingly vote with their feet or their laptops, not a binary. From special economic zones to charter cities to crypto communities, there's a growing marketplace for governance, and people will increasingly vote with their feet or their laptops. Tell me more about the book. Sovereign Individual. James J. Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg is remarkably prescient. Also, want to look into Lee Kuan Yew because that's apparently something that, yeah, I didn't know much about Lee Kuan Yew, but Lee Kuan Yew, it's so funny. Like, I just found a podcast and it was talking about Lee Kuan Yew and his vision, his purpose, and it's amazing. Let's look into it. Throughout history, the dominant form of political organization is determined by the economics of violence, specifically who can use force effectively and at what cost. Information age will make it drastically harder for states to coerce individuals, shifting power from governments to capable individuals. The dominant form of political organization is determined by the economics of violence, specifically who can use force effectively and at what cost. The information age will make it drastically harder for states to coerce individuals, shifting power from governments to capable individuals. The megapolitics framework argues that technology determines politics, not the other way around. Gunpowder enabled nation states by making large armies decisive. The printing press enabled democracy by creating informed publics. The microprocessor will dissolve nation states by making wealth invisible and portable. Technology determines politics, not the other way around. Gunpowder enabled nation states by making large armies decisive. The printing press enabled democracy by creating informed publics. Hmm. The microprocessor will dissolve nation states by making wealth invisible and portable. Wow. Wow. Oh my God. That was so good. The microprocessor will dissolve nation states by making wealth invisible and portable. My God. The megapolitics framework. Economics of violence, specifically who can use force effectively and at what cost. Information age will make it drastically harder for states to coerce individuals, shifting power from governments to capable individuals. Most striking predictions. They essentially predicted cryptocurrency, describing digital money that would be denominated in a new way beyond government control, enabling individuals to move wealth across borders invisibly. This was written over a decade before Bitcoin. They foresaw remote work and jurisdictional arbitrage, that knowledge workers would choose where to live based on tax and regulatory regimes, forcing governments to compete for productive citizens like hotels compete for guests. Remote work and jurisdictional arbitrage, where to live based on tax and regulatory regimes, forcing governments to compete for productive citizens like hotels compete for guests. They predicted the decline of mass democracy, arguing that when the most productive people can exit, the old social contract, pay taxes or we jail you, breaks down. Governments become subscription services rather than monopolies. The customers versus extortion victims distinction is central. They argue that citizenship will evolve from a coercive relationship, you are born somewhere, you owe taxes, into a voluntary one. Productive individuals will negotiate terms with jurisdictions. The agricultural to industrial parallel. Just as feudalism collapsed when the industrial economy made land less important than capital, the nation state will weaken as the information economy makes physical location less important than knowledge and networks. Just as feudalism collapsed when the industrial economy made land less important than capital, the nation state will weaken as the information economy makes physical location less important than knowledge and networks. The dark side they predicted too: rising populism and nationalism as a backlash from those who lose status in the transition. Governments becoming more desperate and extractive before they lose control, and a growing divide between a mobile cognitive elite and a rooted underclass. The dark side they predicted too: rising populism and nationalism as a backlash from those who lose status in the transition. Governments becoming more desperate and extractive before they lose control, and a growing divide between a mobile cognitive elite and a rooted underclass. Just as feudalism collapsed when the industrial economy made land less important than capital, the nation state will weaken as information economy makes physical location less important than knowledge and networks. Where it's controversial, the book has a liber- libertarian, almost social Darwinist edge. It treats the decline of redistributive democracy as largely positive and shows little concern for those left behind. Critics argue it romanticizes a world where the wealthy simply opt out of social obligations. It treats the decline of redistributive democracy as largely positive and shows little concern for those left behind. Critics argue it romanticizes a world where the wealthy simply opt out of social obligations. Essentially, the optimistic community oriented response to this book, where Davidson and Rees-Mogg see atomized sovereign individuals. Balaji asks, what if those individuals organize into new collective structures voluntarily? That reads better 25 plus years later than when it was published. Hmm. Frontier of the American Society. I forgot what the book is called, but it's something like this. Frontier of the American World, Frontier of the American Society, something like that. Let's see. The Frontier in American History, okay, by Frederick Jackson Turner. Exactly. Claude is smart. Claude is smart. Most influential books in American historiography. The Turner thesis, the American frontier was the defining force in shaping a nation's character, democracy, and identity. Not European heritage, not the Constitution, not great leaders. The frontier made America different. The frontier as a rebirth machine. Each time settlers pushed westward into wilderness, they were stripped of their European customs and forced to adapt. The American frontier was a defining force in shaping the nation's character, democracy, and identity. Not European heritage, not the Constitution, not great leaders. The frontier made America different. The American frontier was a defining force in shaping the nation's character, democracy, and identity. Not European heritage, not the Constitution, not great leaders. The frontier made America different. The frontier as a rebirth machine. Each time settlers pushed westward into wilderness, they were stripped of their European customs and forced to adapt. This constant cycle of regression to civilization produced something new, a distinctly American character marked by self reliance, pragmatism, and egalitarianism. Wow. The frontier made America different. Each time settlers pushed westward into wilderness, they were stripped of their European customs and forced to adapt. The constant cycle of regression to civilization produced something new, a distinctly American character marked by self reliance, pragmatism, and egalitarianism. This is very interesting because this is exactly what's happening. Because we are moving to the frontier, we are we are facing a lot of problems, and that is exactly forcing us to be self-reliant, pragmatic, and egalitarianism. Democracy grew from the ground up. Turner argued that democratic institutions didn't trickle down from Eastern elites. Democratic institutions didn't trickle down from Eastern elites. They emerged organically in frontier communities where social hierarchies were flattened by necessity. Everyone had to cooperate, everyone had a voice, and free land meant no one had to be subservient. Democracy grew from the ground up. Turner argued that democratic institutions didn't trickle down from Eastern city, Eastern elites. Democratic institutions didn't trickle down from the Eastern elites. They emerged organically in frontier communities where social hierarchies were flattened by necessity. Necessity. Everyone had to cooperate, everyone had a voice, and free land meant no one had to be subservient. Five key recurring themes from the essays: the critical role of free land pulling people westward, the fluid nature of frontier society facilitating democracy and individualism, the corrosive effects of concentrated wealth through industrial capitalism, the role of migration patterns or Midwestern culture and political antagonism between the interior backwoods and the cities. Five key recurring themes from the essays: the critical role of free land pulling people westward, the fluid nature of frontier society, the fluid nature of frontier society facilitating democracy and individualism, the corrosive effects of concentrated wealth through industrial capitalism, the role of migration patterns on Midwestern culture, and political antagonism between the interior backwoods and the cities. Self reliance, pragmatism, and egalitarianism. The frontier is a valve. As long as cheap land existed in the West, social discontent in eastern cities could be relieved. Unhappy workers could simply move west and start fresh. This prevented the class rigidity and revolutionary pressures seen in Europe. This is so interesting. This is so interesting. It's pretty much the same stuff. Pretty much the same stuff. You're like, okay, I'm not happy. Just go west. Just keep going west. Just keep going west. And that's why in California, you might have the people who are the most risk taking. Wow. Wow. Okay. Let me see. Is this the reason why the people of California were the most risk taking? Because they always kept pushing westward to the frontier. The US census of 1819 declared the frontier closed. There was no longer a continuous line of unsettled territory. Turner saw this as a turning point. The engine that had driven American democracy and individualism for 3 centuries had shut off. What would replace it? Why it still matters in the context of your previous reads. Turner's thesis connects directly to both the sovereign individual and the network state. Turner essentially asked what happens when the frontier disappears. What happens when the frontier disappears? Davidson and Rees-Mogg would answer: cyberspace becomes the new frontier, borderless, ungoverned, full of opportunity for those who move first. And biology would add: we don't just need a new frontier, we need to build new societies on it. The through line across all three books is that human freedom and innovation depend on the existence of an open frontier, physical or digital, where people can escape incumbent power structures and build something new. That's a really sharp connection. The selection effect. The people who ended up in California were, by definition, the ones who kept going. They passed through the Appalachians, crossed the Great Plains, pushed through the Rockies, and still didn't stop. Each frontier filtered for a more restless, risk tolerant population. California got the most extreme distillation of that pioneer temperament. The gold rush amplified this. The 1849 gold rush attracted a very specific type: people willing to gamble everything on a long shot payoff in unknown territory. That's essentially the psychology of a startup founder. It's no accident Silicon Valley inherited this culture. Turner recognized the pattern. The frontier mentality didn't die when the physical frontier closed in 1890. It transferred. In California, specifically, it moved from land to technology. The same impulse that drove someone to cross the continent on the chance of finding gold drives someone to drop out of Stanford and build a company in a garage. Garage. The geographic endpoint matters too. California is literally where the continent ends. There was nowhere left to go physically, so the restless energy had to go somewhere. It went upward into aerospace, Southern California, and inward into software and digital frontiers, Northern California. Very interesting. Very interesting. Went upward into aerospace in SoCal and went inward into software and digital frontiers, Northern California. It also connects back to your earlier reads. Balaji explicitly made this argument the Silicon Valley culture is a direct descendant of frontier culture. The crypto and network states are what happens when frontier people run out of physical land and start building in cyberspace. Okay, so what is the frontier of the present? What are all the frontiers of the present? The frontier is defined as to define an ungoverned space of opportunity where incumbents have no advantage, individuals can build from scratch. There are several active frontiers right now. Cyberspace AI, this is the most obvious one. We're in the early settlement phase of AI, the way the 1990s were the early settlement phase of the internet. The rules aren't written yet. The territory is vast, and a small team can build something that rivals what billion-dollar incumbents have. This is where most of the frontier energy is concentrated today. Crypto and programmable money. Regardless of what you think about the speculation, the underlying idea is frontier like building financial systems outside the control of existing institutions. DeFi stablecoins, tokenized assets, these are attempts to create new economic territory that no government fully controls yet. The most literal new frontier, SpaceX Blue Origin, and others are making access to orbit dramatically cheaper. Mars colonization is the ultimate Turner thesis for play. A new continent where you start from scratch and build new societies. This is the frontier Elon Musk explicitly talks about. Biology and longevity, gene editing, synthetic biology, and life extension are frontiers in a different sense. They are expanding the boundaries of what it means to be human. If you can extend healthy lifespan by decades, you have essentially created new time the way the West created new land. Jurisdictional frontiers, special economic zones, charter cities, free zones in places like Dubai, Singapore, and emerging projects in Honduras, prosper and elsewhere. These are attempts to create governance frontiers, small territories where you can experiment with new rules. This is Balaji's network state thesis in physical form. The ocean, seasteading, building permanent communities in international waters. It's a small but real movement. The ocean is the last ungoverned physical space on Earth. Solo creator with a laptop can now build an audience and income that would have required an entire media company 20 years ago. The land here is the audience and it's still relatively open. What connects them all? Every true frontier shares three properties: low barriers to entry, no established hierarchy, and asymmetric upside for early movers. The question isn't really which frontier matters most, but which one matches your temperament. The gold rush attracted gamblers, the homestead act attracted farmers. Different frontiers select for different kinds of pioneers. That's what made the American frontier historically significant. Not just that people made money, but that they built new ways of living together. But that standard AI network states are probably the most consequential frontiers of our time. Financial systems outside the control of existing institutions, DeFi, stablecoins, tokenized assets, these are attempts to create new economic territory that no government fully controls yet. I am curious. Which of these frontiers will actually produce new cultures and new forms of governance? Probably the most consequential frontiers of all time. Very interesting. I'm actually curious, what are all the other biology books that we can look into? Let's see. I will pause the screen for a minute and I'll go find the books. All right, find me the books. Oh yeah, Lee Kuan Yew. So we want to look into Lee Kuan Yew. Let's go. How innovation works, and Lee Kuan Yew book is from third world to west. Okay, parfait, parfait. Whoa, KT. Whoa, whoa, didn't work. Okay. Key takeaways from this book. Lee Kuan Yew. We're looking at Lee Kuan Yew, most remarkable political memoirs ever written. Essentially, the story of how Lee Kuan Yew took a tiny, resource-less swamp with no army and turned into one of the wealthiest nations on earth in a single generation. Survival was never guaranteed. Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965. It had no natural resources, no hinterland, no military, and hostile neighbors. Lee describes weeping on national television that day. Lee describes weeping on national television that day. Everything that followed was driven by an almost existential desperation, the knowledge that failure meant that the country simply ceases to exist. Pragmatism over ideology, always. Lee's governing philosophy was radically anti dogmatic. He didn't care whether a policy was capitalist or socialist, he cared whether it worked. He studied what succeeded in other countries, adapted it ruthlessly, and discarded whatever didn't produce results. This is the opposite of how most political leaders operate. Multiracialism as a survival strategy. Chinese majority was surrounded by Malay Muslim nations. Multiracialism and meritocracy, the foundation principles, not out of idealism, but because ethnic conflict would have destroyed the country. Public housing was deliberately integrated by racial quotas. English was chosen as the common language over Chinese to prevent any ethnic group from having an advantage. Incorruptible government as competitive advantage. Understood that for a small nation to attract foreign investment, it had to be trusted. He paid civil servants and ministers well, pegging salaries to private sector benchmarks and punished corruption mercilessly, including among close political allies. The message was clear: Singapore's word is reliable. Human capital is everything. With no resources, Lee bet everything on people. Education was treated as a national security priority. He aggressively recruited multinational corporations, not just for jobs, but to train Singaporeans in world class skills. The entire country was treated as a corporation competing for global talent and capital. Education was treated as a national security priority. He aggressively recruited multinational corporations just for jobs, but to train, not just for jobs, but to train Singaporeans in world class skills. The entire country was treated as a corporation competing for global talent and capital. Infrastructure as nation building. Public housing wasn't just welfare, it was social engineering. The government built high quality housing and sold it to citizens at subsidized rates. Social engineering, the government built high quality housing and sold it to citizens at subsidized rates, creating a nation of homeowners with a literal stake in the country's success. I think that is so big. That is so big. If you have homes, if you own homes, then you are kind of creating stake in the country. Yeah, this is so important. That when you don't have home, you start thinking differently. You think that I'm just renting. I'm renting this, I'm renting this, I'm renting everything. And then you start thinking about it makes you really think about world as a subscription service then. When you make it hard for people to own things, You start thinking about everything in life as a subscription service, which is both good and bad, which is something that was done bad, but it's turning out pretty good. Okay. High quality housing and sold to citizens at subsidized rates, creating a nation of homeowners with a literal stake in the country's success. Changi Airport, the port, the greening of the city, every infrastructure decision was designed to signal that Singapore was first world. The hard truths about democracy. Lee was openly skeptical of Western style liberal democracy for developing nations. He argued that in multi ethnic post colonial societies, premature democracy leads to ethnic populism and chaos. He believed good governance mattered more than democratic processes and pointed to Singapore's results as evidence. This remains his most controversial stance. Foreign policy as a small country. Chapters on navigating between the great powers, the US, China, India, Asian neighbors, are masterful. His core principle: be useful to everyone, dependent on no one, and always punch above your weight diplomatically. Be useful to everyone, dependent on no one, and always punch above your weight diplomatically. He cultivated personal relationships with every major world leader for decades. The role of the leaders, well, what comes through most strongly is the sheer force of personal conviction. Lee banned chewing gum, caned caned vandals, fought the unions, resisted Western media criticism, and never apologized. Whether you admire this or find it authoritarian, the book makes clear that Singapore's transformation required someone willing to make deeply unpopular decisions and endure the criticism. The deepest insight connecting to your earlier reads, Lee essentially proved that governance is a technology. It can be designed, optimized, and iterated on. Singapore is the closest real-world example of what Balaji theorizes about with network states and what the sovereign individual predicts about jurisdictional competition. Lee created a jurisdiction so well governed that people and capital voluntarily flowed to it. Can what Lee did be replicated without a Lee? Success depended enormously on one extraordinary individual governing for decades with near absolute power. That's not a scalable model, which is precisely the problem biology is trying to solve with network states. What is the current state of Singaporean government? Is it at the same level as Lee? Let's see, I'm curious. Find me key takeaways of the book How Innovation Works by Matt Ridley. But the era of a singular towering figure is over. Current leader Lawrence Wong became Singapore's fourth prime minister in May 24. Lee Kuan Yew's son, who governed from 2004 to 2024. First leadership transition to someone outside the Lee family. Wong's background is classic Singapore meritocracy. In a public H.D.B. Flat started as an economist at the Ministry of Trade and Industry during the 97 Asian financial crisis, worked his way through multiple ministries before becoming PM. His competent, technocratic, deeply embedded in the system, Lee Kuan Yew built. He won a strong mandate, PAP to victory with an increased vote share in the 2025 general election. Comfortable with the transition. The tone has shifted. Looking at his recent speeches, Wong is more collaborative and consultative than either Lee. He emphasizes that national resilience does not depend only on the government, it depends on all of us. Very important, very important, very important. You have to be collaborative. You have to think that you have to have high agency residents, you have to have high agency citizens. That is very important. Prime Minister's Office, Singapore, and talks about uplifting lower income families and supporting people with disabilities. This is a softer, more inclusive brand of governance than Lee Kuan Yew's iron-fisted pragmatism. But the challenges are fundamentally different now. Singapore is navigating a much harder geopolitical landscape. Wong has acknowledged that long-standing assumptions about open markets and win-win cooperation are being questioned and sometimes rejected, and that geopolitical tensions have deepened. Most urgently, the Middle East conflict has disrupted energy supplies through the Strait of Hormuz, sharply reducing oil and energy flows, with oil prices rising more than 60%. A direct threat to a resource dependent island nation. Arguably the most durable part of his legacy, and it's still functioning well. The institutions, the anti corruption framework, the meritocratic civil service, the strategic reserves, these continue to operate regardless of who sits at the top. But Lee Kuan Yew was a founder. Founders operate differently from inheritors. He could make radical bets because there was nothing to lose. Wong is managing an incredibly successful system in an increasingly hostile world. His job is preservation and adaptation, not creation. That's a different skill set entirely. The deeper question, built by an extraordinary individual, can sustain itself through ordinary successors? Singapore's answer so far is yes, but the real test will come when it faces a true existential crisis without a Lee at the helm. What does a high agency citizen of a country looks like? No, 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 no. I didn't ask highly. I didn't ask. Whoa, I can change it? They're informed, not hypnotized. They act, not just opine. They build within the system, start companies, create jobs, improve institutions instead of only criticizing them. They strengthen social fabric. It's pretty much the same. They're informed but not hypnotized. They understand incentives behind decisions. They can steal men opposing views. They update beliefs without ego friction. Think less breaking new addict, more calm systems thinker. They vote when it matters. They show up to local discussions or initiatives. They contribute time, money, or skills to causes. They build within the system. This is the underrated one. Start companies, create jobs, improve institutions instead of only criticizing them. They see the country as a modifiable code, not a fixed reality. They help neighbors, mentor, connect people. They reduce friction in everyday interactions. They make cooperation feel natural. If trust is the invisible infrastructure, they are laying bricks daily. They hold a long term orientation. Short term outrage is easy. Long term thinking is rare. They care about education, infrastructure, demographics. They think in decades, not election cycles. They care about education, infrastructure, demographics. They think in decades, not election cycles. They ask what would make this place better in 20 years. They are in quiet conversation with their future grandchildren. They balance loyalty and criticism. Blind patriotism is brittle. Pure cynicism is sterile. A highly engaged citizen defends what's worth preserving, critiques what needs to evolve, doesn't outsource responsibility to them. They are locally rooted, globally aware. They understand their country and how it fits in the world. They learn from other systems. They import good ideas without losing local context. They aren't trapped in national echo chambers. Blind patriotism is brittle. Pure cynicism is sterile. Defends what's worth preserving. A highly engaged citizen behaves like a co-founder of the country, not legally, not formally, but psychologically. They think, if this place fails, I fail to contribute enough. If it improves, I helped, however, slightly. Despite having the ability to lead, that transform citizenship from obligation to alignment, birthright to active subscription. If you zoom out, the rarest citizens are not the loudest or most ideological. They are the ones quietly compounding competence, trust, contribution. What does a high agency citizen of a country. Let's see. Let's specifically go for agency. Uh-oh. This is very close to my audio mixer. All right. Co-author of the country, not waiting for the system to update, but quietly shipping patches into it. Like a product, not a given. Most people relate to their country like weather, something to complain about. A high agency citizen relates to it like a startup. What's broken? What can I improve? Where are the leverage points? They don't default to exit or blind loyalty. They explore, reform, build alternatives, or strategically exit and re enter. A high agency citizen relates to it like a startup. What's broken? What can I improve? Where are the leverage points? They don't default to exit or blind loyalty. They explore, reform, build alternatives, or strategically exit and re enter. They build, don't just critique. Low agency, the system is corrupt. High agency, files, paperwork, charts, org, funds, initiative, or prototypes of workaround. They start local projects, housing co-ops, schools, media, startups, create parallel systems if needed, turn ideas into institutions, think less, Twitter thread more, I raised 50K and tried something. Low agency, the system is correct. High agency, files, paperwork, starts, org, funds, initiative, prototypes of workaround. They start local projects, create parallel systems if needed, turn ideas into institutions. They understand how power actually works. They don't confuse formal rules with real dynamics. They know who actually makes decisions, how incentives shape behavior, where bottlenecks are. So instead of shouting at the sky, they navigate systems, build coalitions, apply pressure where it matters. They invest in the long term fabric. They're not just extracting value, they are compounding it. It shows up as paying attention to education, culture, norms, supporting institutions that outlive them, thinking in decades, not election cycles. They ask, will this make the country stronger in 20 years? They're not just extracting value, they're compounding it. They create networks, not just opinions. A high agency citizen is rarely solo. They create networks, not just opinions. A high agency citizen is rarely solo. They gather smart, motivated people, form communities around shared goals, turn alignment into action because real change is coordinated, not individual. A high agency citizen is rarely solo. They gather smart, motivated people, form communities around shared goals, turn alignment into action. They balance rights with responsibility. They use their freedoms, speech to persuade, capital to build mobility, to choose better environments, speech to persuade, capital to build mobility, to choose better environments, but they also carry responsibility, contribute, not just consume, participate, not just observe. They're globally aware, locally effective. They study what works in other countries, import good ideas, adapt them to local context. They are not trapped in this is how we have always done it. They bias toward action under uncertainty. They don't wait for perfect clarity. They run experiments, accept small failures, they treat in public or semi-public. Their mindset progress over perfection. Basically a hybrid of founder, investor, diplomat, steward, the sharpest insight in a world of individuals gaining power, communities becoming proto countries. The high agency citizen is evolving into something new, someone who can choose, shape, or even create the system they live in. Very cool. I'm happy we asked the question. Survival was never guaranteed. How innovation works. Innovation is not invention. This is the book's foundational distinction. Innovation is the turning of inventions into things of. I need to start maybe streaming early in the day because I'm starting to feel so exhausted right now. Wow. Wow. Yeah, we need to manage our energies pretty well. I need depth. I need depth of knowledge. I need depth. Innovation is not invention. This is the book's foundational distinction. Innovation is the turning of inventions into things of practical and affordable use to people. Innovation is the turning of inventions into things of practical and affordable use to people. Inventing a technology is only the beginning. Making it cheap, reliable, and widely adopted is the real innovation. The light bulb existed before Edison. Edison made it work for millions. There is no eureka moment. Innovation is a long term process of combining people who add iterations of ideas and features based on trial and error with no breakthrough moment. Innovation is a long term process of combining people who add iterations of ideas and features based on trial and error with no breakthrough moment. Almost every innovation we attribute to a single genius was actually the product of many minds working incrementally over years or decades. Simultaneous discovery is the norm, not the exception. 21 different people came up with the idea of the light bulb around the same time. The steam engine, the telephone, calculus, the radio, all were independently developed by multiple people simultaneously. This suggests that innovations emerge when conditions are ripe, not when a particular genius appears. Ideas having sex, early signature concept. Innovation happens when ideas from different domains combine and recombine. Geographically concentrated because it requires an ecosystem where one person's idea at a cocktail party goes to the next person at a coffee shop, goes into a prototype, which goes to a VC. This is why innovation clusters in specific places. Renaissance, Florence, Victorian Britain, Silicon Valley. Trial and error beats planning. Obsessive trial and error works. Very interesting. Very interesting. Very interesting. Obsessive trial and error works better than inspiration. Edison tried 6,000 different plant materials before finding the right filament. Innovation is fundamentally Darwinian generation variation. Select what works, discard what doesn't. Science often follows technology, not the other way around. Science mostly comes after the invention. The steam engine was built before thermodynamics was understood. Vaccines were used before germ theory existed. The steam engine was built before thermodynamics was understood. Hmm. Science mostly comes after the invention. The steam engine was built before thermodynamics was understood. Vaccines were used before germ theory existed. The common assumption that basic research leads to applied technology is often backwards. Freedom is the essential ingredient. Free societies permit the open exchange of ideas, while top down, centrally planned societies inevitably stifle, interfere with, and inappropriately divert resources away from innovation. Freedom is the essential ingredient. Free societies permit the open exchange of ideas, while top down, centrally planned societies inevitably stifle, interfere with, and inappropriately divert resources away from innovation. Ridley argues that permissionless innovation, being able to experiment without asking regulators first, is what separates innovative societies from stagnant ones. Science often follows technology, not the other way around. Science mostly comes after the innovation. The steam engine was built before thermodynamics was understood. Vaccines were used before germ theory existed. The common assumption that basic research leads to applied technology is often backwards. Regulation and incumbents are innovation's enemies. In the nuclear industry, it has been impossible to innovate because regulators take so long to approve a new design that you are broke before you even break ground. Big business and big government often collaborate, intentionally or not, to protect existing players and suppress disruptive newcomers. Timing is everything. A lot of old ideas that failed weren't necessarily bad ideas. They were just the wrong time. In 1999, we had Webvan and Pets.com, which failed. But now we have Instacart and DoorDash. Innovation requires a stack of supporting innovations to already be in place. Jump too far ahead and you fail. Timing is everything. A lot of old ideas that failed weren't necessarily bad ideas. They were just the wrong time. In 1999, we had Webvan, Pets.com, which failed, but now we have Instacart and DoorDash. Innovation requires a stack of supporting innovations to already be in place. Jump too far ahead and you fail. You may face an innovation famine really wants an increasing regulation, risk aversion, and institutional sclerosis could slow innovation dramatically. Regulation kills innovation and benefits incumbents. No innovation means a stagnant economy. Connected to your earlier reads, Ridley's argument maps perfectly onto the frontier thesis. The frontier, whether physical or digital, is essentially the space where permissionless innovation happens. Turner's frontier was a place free from established hierarchies. Lee Kuan Yew created a governed version of that in Singapore, a place deliberately designed to attract innovation through low regulation and high trust. And Balaji's network state is an attempt to create new jurisdictions specifically optimized for the kind of freedom Ridley argues innovation requires. Innovation requires freedom from incumbents, but successful societies eventually produce powerful incumbents. Successful. Very interesting. Very interesting. But these are the uncomfortable synthesis across all these books. Innovation requires freedom from incumbents, but successful societies eventually produce powerful incumbents who restrict that freedom. The frontier closes. The question is always, where does the next one open? The question is always, where does the next one open? This is so interesting. This is so interesting. Like today, as he put the books down over there, as people, there was this one guy who was reading, who picked up the Buddhism book, and he liked it so much that he actually took it with him. And I didn't see it for a long time. And what he was doing is he picked up this one book, which is all about the human dynamics of conversation, and then he's trying to relate that with Buddhism book. And I thought that was really cool. I'm like, wow, I didn't know I could put this random book in front of you and you could come up with something interesting. But this is it. Books are technology. Books are technology, and you need that technology to be in front of you all the time to remind you, to remind you. You need the technology in front of you all the time. This is called psycho-cybernetics, changing your environment to change your behavior. It's pretty cool. It's really cool. Connecting to your earlier reads, innovation requires freedom from incumbents, but successful societies eventually produce powerful incumbents. I'll pause this. I'll check out another book that we can see. Principles for dealing with the changing world order when money dies. Okay, let's check out this one. Key takeaways of this book. What? Key takeaways of this book. All right, all right, all right. Let's see. A Many Dies by Adam Ferguson. Germany abandoned the gold standard in 1914 at the outbreak of World War One and faced massive war reparations and the Treaty of Versailles, leading to deficit financing and unchecked monetary expansion that collapsed the German mark. By December 23, the exchange rate was $1 to, oh my God, okay. The country was reduced to barter. Nobody understood what was happening while it was happening. This is perhaps the book's most chilling insight. This is perhaps the book's most chilling insight. The Reichsbank president Rudolf Havenstein believed his most important duty was printing more money since people clearly needed it to make purchases. Naturally, this only made the problem worse. But since stock exchanges were closed, foreign exchange rates were not published, and shortages also raised prices. The real source of inflation was opaque, the worthy house. The nightmare of deficit spending, devaluation, hyperinflation in Weimar, Germany. The people running the system couldn't see that they were the problem. The it can go on fallacy. For half a decade after 1918, a common theme in German diaries, newspapers, and diplomatic dispatches was that things could not go on like this any longer. Yet they did, and they got worse month after month, year after year. People assumed there was some natural flow or some point where sanity would reassert itself. There wasn't. Velocity kills. Monetary velocity sped ever higher, further increasing inflation since nobody wanted to hold cash that would quickly devalue, instead spending it as quickly as possible, preferably on something that would hold value. Once people once people lose faith in money, the act of fleeing money accelerates its destruction. This is the death spiral, a feedback loop with no natural break. Wow. Society in words, the social consequences were more devastating than the economic ones. The great industrialists best able to move large amounts of capital and engage in cross-border transactions line their pockets. Those with dollars or foreign currency lived like kings, eating at fine restaurants, while thin and hungry men, not long before the social elite, passed bitterly by. Middle class apartments emptied as books, pianos, and furniture were exchanged for food. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy wealth, it reverses the social order. Savers are punished, speculators are rewarded, and the moral framework of a society collapses. The middle class is destroyed first and most completely. The period of hyperinflation resulted in significant difficulties for middle class Germans and those who were more educated. The rich had hard assets and foreign currency, the poor had little to lose. But the middle class, professionals, teachers, civil servants, had their life savings in the currency. They went from respectable to destitute overnight. Hyperinflation is a political choice disguised as an economic event. Germany chose to amass debt to support its wartime activities rather than imposing significant taxes. The expectations of a quick victory played a role, even as the war persisted with diminishing prospects. The government persisted in its reliance on newly created money. Governments print money because the alternative, taxing people or cutting spending, is politically painful. They choose the hidden tax of inflation over the visible tax of legislation. It breeds extremism. Left wing and right wing parties both benefited from the chaos and dissatisfaction, leading, among other events, to the beer hall push in November 1923. When the middle class is destroyed and institutions lose legitimacy, people turn to anyone who promises to restore order at any cost. The line from hyperinflation to Hitler is direct. The modern parallel is explicit quantitative easing, that modern euphemism for surreptitious deficit financing in an electronic era can no less become an assault on monetary discipline. Warning is that you don't need physical printing presses to destroy currency. You just need governments willing to borrow endlessly and central banks willing to accommodate them. Connected to your earlier reads, this book is the horror story that motivates everything in the sovereign individual. In the network state, Davidson and Rees-Mogg predicted that governments facing fiscal crisis would become increasingly extractive and inflationary, and that smart individuals would flee to jurisdictions or digital currencies beyond government reach. Bitcoin was literally created in response to the 2008 bailouts, with Satoshi embedding a newspaper headline about bank bailouts in the Genesis block. Weimar Germany is the worst case of what happens when you can't exit, when you are trapped in a collapsing currency with no alternative. Lee Kuan Yew understood this too. Singapore's obsession with fiscal discipline, massive reserves, and sound money is essentially a permanent inoculation against the disease Ferguson describes. Small nations that depend on trust can't afford to play games with the currency. The deepest lesson: the destruction of money is the destruction of trust, and the destruction of trust is the destruction of civilization. The destruction of money is the destruction of trust, and the destruction of trust is the destruction of civilization. Everything else, the political extremism, the social collapse, the moral decay follows from the single break. This is so interesting. It's so interesting. Wow. All right, that's the stream. Merci.